Still breathing, I thought relics like you belonged in a museum. That's what the clerk said, loud enough for the whole office to hear. The old man back-hunched metals faded. Didn't argue. He just placed the denied pension form on the desk and walked out. 30 minutes later, a convoy of black SUVs screeched to a halt, and when a four-star general stepped in and asked, "Which one of you insulted Colonel Morgan?" Nobody dared speak. If you believe respect should be earned and never forgotten, comment honor below. Colonel Arthur Morgan. 81 walked into the Veterans Affairs office wearing a threadbare suit that had been tailored decades ago when his shoulders still stood proud. His gnarled hands clutched a thick folder of documents, nearly 4 decades of service to a country that seemed to have forgotten him. He didn't come to beg. He simply wanted to understand why his military pension had been suspended 3 months ago, and why his recent letters of inquiry had mysteriously gone missing. According to the automated phone system he had navigated for weeks, on his chest pinned with perfect precision, despite arthritic fingers, were medals that had faded with time, but not significance. Bronze star, silver, star, Purple Heart. Each told a story of sacrifice few in the modern world could comprehend, but the eyes of the staff behind the glass partition didn't register these symbols. They saw only another elderly veteran taking up their time with paperwork and problems. One of them, Tyler, perhaps 25, with styled hair and a phone perpetually within reach, glanced at Morgan's file with undisguised boredom before a smirk crossed his face. "Still breathing, I thought relics like you belonged in a museum," he said, voice deliberately pitched to carry across the waiting area. Chuckles rippled through the office. A few other employees stifled smiles behind computer screens. No one corrected him, no one intervened. Colonel Morgan didn't flinch, didn't raise his voice. Decades of command had taught him the power of dignified silence. He simply placed the pension denial form back on the counter, straightened his jacket with a slight tremor in his weathered hands, and walked toward the exit with measured steps that masked his pain. An elderly woman sitting in the corner watched it all, her eyes narrowing as the door closed behind the colonel. She had noticed what the staff had not: the slight stiffening of his posture, the momentary flash of hurt, quickly masked by military bearing. Outside, a cold wind cut through Morgan's thin jacket. The walk from the bus stop had taken more out of him than he cared to admit. His modest apartment was 15 blocks away, and the pension he'd earned through blood and sacrifice was what kept the heat on through winter months. He settled heavily onto a stone bench outside the building, catching his breath before the long walk home. From his breast pocket, he withdrew a black and white photograph, its edges soft from decades of handling his unit in Iraq. 1984. 8 young men, arms around, shoulders, faces full of purpose and determination. 4 never came home. The rest came back forever changed. Inside, Tyler was still laughing with colleagues, these old guys and their war stories. Like, "Hello, it's 2012. Nobody cares anymore." Another colleague nodded, probably making up half his service record anyway. They all do. But in the corner, the elderly woman who had witnessed everything quietly took out her phone and typed a simple message to a number few would recognize. "He's been disrespected. VA office downtown today." Colonel Morgan sat motionless on the cold bench, callous thumb tracing the faces in the photograph. Not just brothers in arms. Family in the truest sense. Men who had seen him at his best and worst, who had trusted him with their lives. James Hendricks, gone in a flash of artillery fire. Michael Chen lost, while pulling 2 civilians from a collapsed building. Thomas Williams and Samir Patel, both taken during the same midnight ambush. This wasn't just grief he carried. It was the reason he still believed in systems, in order, in honor. Despite disappointments that would have broken lesser men, his men deserved a commander who wouldn't quit fighting even decades later. Even when the battlefield was now government offices and paperwork inside the VA building, Tyler had pulled up Colonel Morgan's digital file on his computer, scrolling through it with casual disregard. "Look at this," he called to a co-worker. "Says here he led some classified operation in Baghdad. Sure, Grandpa, and I'm secretly a Navy SEAL." His colleague laughed, not bothering to lower her voice, probably typed up his own records. Half these old guys can't even remember what they had for breakfast. Neither noticed the elderly woman in the corner who had finished her text message and now sat watching them with the still patience of someone. Accustomed to waiting for justice, she had recognized Colonel Morgan immediately, not from television or newspapers, but from a small photograph on her own mantel. Her late husband standing beside Morgan in the Iraqi desert. Both younger than both still believing they could change the world through service and sacrifice. Exactly 31 minutes after her message was sent, 3 black SUVs with government plates turned into the parking lot. Simultaneously, their precision suggesting military coordination rather than coincidence, pedestrians stopped to stare. Employees peered through windows, conversations dying mid-sentence. From the lead vehicle emerged General Isaac Chambers. 4 silver stars gleaming on his shoulders, dress uniform impeccable face, set in granite determination. 6 junior officers flanked him, moving with purpose toward the building's entrance. The front doors swung open with force. General Chambers didn't pause at the security desk, didn't stop to remove his hat, didn't announce his presence through proper channels. His voice, when it came, filled the room without needing to shout, the voice of a man accustomed to being heard the first time. Which one of you insulted Colonel Morgan? Silence fell like a hammer. Computer keys stopped clicking. Conversations halted. Even the background music playing through ceiling speakers seemed to fade. Tyler, who had been leaning back in his chair moments before, sat upright, blood draining from his face. I asked a question. The general continued scanning the room, with eyes that had assessed battlefields and determined men's fates. I expect an answer. The office manager emerged from her door, straightening her blazer. General, perhaps we could discuss this in private. There was nothing private about Colonel Morgan's humiliation. He cut her off, so there will be nothing private about the accountability. He gestured toward the doors where 2 of his officers now stood on either side of Colonel Morgan, who appeared both confused and concerned by the sudden activity. That man out there, the general continued, voice lowering to intensity that commanded more attention than any shout, saved my life in Fallujah, carried me 3 miles under enemy fire after I was wounded, refused evacuation until every man under his command was accounted for. The elderly woman in the corner smiles slightly, a silent satisfaction crossing her features. Colonel Morgan has been attempting to resolve a clerical error with his pension for 3 months. 3 months of letters, phone calls, and visits. And today he was not only denied assistance, again he was openly mocked. Tyler shrunk visibly in his seat, eyes fixed on his keyboard. I want to know who thought it appropriate to disrespect a man who has given more to this country than everyone in this room combined. No one moved. No one spoke. The general's eyes found Tyler, whose nervous swallowing and averted gaze might as well have been a signed confession. I see, the general said quietly. Courage seems in short supply here. He turned and walked out, leaving a vacuum of shame behind him. Through the glass doors, everyone watched as he approached Colonel Morgan, rendering a perfect salute that acknowledged not just rank, but worth, a man who had once commanded hundreds, now honored by the very institution that had forgotten him. If you believe silence in the face of honor is shameful, share this story and tag someone who still respects our hero. General Isaac Chambers had first met Colonel Morgan 30 years earlier as a cadet at West Point, where Morgan had been an instructor legendary for his uncompromising standards and unexpected compassion. Later, they had served together in conflict zones where Morgan's tactical brilliance and moral clarity had saved not just lives but souls, including Chambers' own during a particularly dark period after losing half his unit in a classified operation. Now standing before his former mentor, Chambers felt the full weight of institutional failure. Connell, he said, maintaining the formality Morgan had always preferred. I apologize on behalf of the entire chain of command for what happened here today. Morgan shook his head slightly. No need, General. I've faced worse than rude clerks. That doesn't make it acceptable. Within an hour, a makeshift press conference had formed on the steps outside the VA building. News vans arrived, alerted by the unusual sight of military vehicles and uniformed personnel. At a civilian government office, General Chambers stood at a hastily arranged podium, Colonel Morgan reluctantly at his side. Today, Chambers began his voice carrying across the growing crowd. We witnessed a fundamental failure of the system designed to support those who supported us. Colonel Arthur Morgan was not just denied his rightfully earned benefits, he was denied basic human dignity. Cameras flashed, microphones clustered. This is not an isolated incident, he continued. It represents a systemic failure to recognize the ongoing debt we owe to those who serve today. I am announcing a complete review of all veteran benefit cases that have been denied or delayed in the past 5 years starting immediately. The entire Veterans Affairs system was put on notice. Every pension case would be audited within 48 hours. A congressional inquiry was initiated before sunset. The video of General Chambers entering the building spread across social media platforms with unprecedented speed, gaining millions of views within 24 hours. Veterans organizations shared it with calls for accountability. Military families added personal stories of similar treatment. By evening, Tyler had been placed on administrative leave pending review. His social media accounts set to private as messages poured in from around the country. The next morning, Colonel Morgan received a call requesting his presence back at the office this time to be presented with full reinstatement of his pension, including all withheld payments from the previous 3 months, along with a formal written apology. The office manager, who had failed to intervene during his humiliation, now couldn't meet his eyes as she processed his paperwork with unprecedented efficiency. "Colonel Morgan," she said quietly, as she handed him his documentation. "I want to personally apologize for what happened yesterday. It was unacceptable." Morgan studied her face for a moment. "Young lady in war, you learn quickly that systems are only as good as the people operating them. Perhaps this will be a reminder of that." As he walked out of the building, he was surprised to find a small crowd, waiting veterans of different eras, some in partial uniform, some bearing visible wounds of service. They formed a silent corridor of respect, many rendering salutes as he passed. The elderly woman who had sent the text waited at the end of this impromptu honor guard. "Helena Patel," she said, extending her hand. "Samir was my husband. He always said you were the finest officer he ever served under recognition," and emotion flickered across Morgan's face. "Mrs. Patel. Samir spoke of you often. He carried your picture everywhere, and I've carried his memory, including his stories about you," she replied. "When I saw how they treated you yesterday, I knew Samir would have wanted me to act." It was her text to General Chambers that had set everything in motion. Colonel Morgan stood straighter than he had in years. For the first time in decades, tears threatened to breach his military bearing. "Thank you," he said simply. General Chambers approached, now dressed in civilian clothes but no less commanding. "Your paperwork is permanently flagged at the highest level, Colonel. This won't happen again." As Morgan walked away from the building, his pension secure, his dignity restored, he didn't speak, but for the first time in many years, he smiled. 1 week later, the mayor organized a special ceremony honoring Colonel Morgan and highlighting the broader issue of veteran treatment within government systems. Morgan refused to give a speech, standing at attention as the national anthem played his posture, defying age and infirmity through sheer force of will. General Chambers approached him afterward, shaking his hand before the assembled crowd, then leaning close to whisper words only Morgan could hear. "Sir, you never stopped serving, now it's our turn." The community erected a simple bronze plaque outside the VA office, engraved with words that captured what had transpired. He never asked to be honored, so we honored him anyway. Tyler, the clerk who had mocked Colonel Morgan, was not fired, as many had demanded. Instead, at Morgan's unexpected request, he was reassigned to a veteran outreach program after completing sensitivity training. Punishment doesn't teach. Morgan had told the administrator making the decision responsibility does. 3 months later, Tyler personally delivered holiday care packages to veterans in the community, including Colonel Morgan. The young man's perspective had been fundamentally altered by working directly with those he had once dismissed. "I was wrong about everything," he admitted to Morgan during that visit. "I didn't understand what service really meant." Morgan nodded, once accepting the apology without needing to verbalize forgiveness. Colonel Morgan returned to his simple life, rising early to bake cookies for young recruits at the nearby base, polishing his medals every Sunday, attending memorial services for veterans who passed with fewer loved ones to remember them. But something had changed in how the world received him. Now, whenever he entered any government building, people stood not because of regulation or requirement, but because word had spread about the man with faded medals and unfaded honor. The review of pension cases that General Chambers had demanded resulted in over 3,000 veterans receiving benefits that had been improperly denied or delayed. Systems were reformed. Training was enhanced. Accountability was established. One small confrontation had cascaded into institutional change. In Veterans Day, Colonel Morgan was asked to raise the flag at the city's central plaza. His hands, still strong despite their age, guided the stars and stripes upward with the same reverence he had shown throughout his life of service. As the flag caught the morning breeze, a formation of fighter jets passed overhead in missing man formation, a tribute arranged by General Chambers for the men in Morgan's old photograph who never came home. The colonel stood at attention, eyes forward, as a single tear finally broke through decades of stoic reserve, not for himself, for them, for the promise kept.